All right, welcome back. Today what we're going to be looking at is the transatlantic slave trade. We are talking about this now because in our timeline that we're following in American history, we're looking at the first African slaves being sent to the Americas in the year 1619. You've probably, I don't know, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. You may have heard of what's called the 1619 Project. This was a piece written by a journalist, essentially stating that American history begins with the year 1619 because that's the year that the first African slaves came to the Americas. Um, we're going to talk today and look at some of maybe where that piece was coming from, but we'll also look at some of the errors behind it. This isn't meant to be like an analysis on that, but with the transatlantic slave trade and with slavery in general, we're talking about controversial issues. We're talking about issues that they're 400 years removed. That was the whole 1619 thing. It came out last year on the 400th anniversary of the first slaves being sent to the Americas. Again, this isn't meant to analyze and critique that journalistic piece, which is what it is. It's a piece of journalism. Yeah, this right here is just more so to deal with how the Atlantic slave trade does impact the United States history, but how it doesn't define it. So let's take a look at our notes for today. So let's actually, before we get to the first slide, I do want to look at this image right here. So this image right here, this is a map, obviously. What we are looking at in the center is the Atlantic Ocean. Now, transatlantic. So trans means across. Trans means across, and Atlantic is obviously this ocean right here. So the transatlantic slave trade is talking about going across the Atlantic. And obviously you can tell by the word slave trade, what we're talking about is going across the Atlantic. Slaves, people. I mean, that's who's going across the Atlantic, people. This continent right here, this is Africa, Northern Africa, and that's going to be the location in which many are imprisoned and then enslaved and sent to the Americas. Looking at this part, we have this is the modern day United States. Modern day United States right here. Canada's up here. Mexico is right here. Central America, all this is South America. And then remember, these islands right here, this is the Caribbean islands. This is the original location of Columbus's voyages. And when Columbus reached the New World, this is where he reached, the Caribbean islands. So we have Africa, we have South America, we have North America, and right here we have Europe. So this is going to be called not just the transatlantic slave trade, but also the triangle trade, because there's 3 points. There is Africa, there is the Americas. We're going to talk specifically about where most slaves do end up, and then Europe. All 3 continents have a major part to play in the transatlantic slave trade. So let's go ahead and jump into our first slide. So first slide, when did the slave trade begin? Okay, so slavery did not start. This is not a recent occurrence. Slavery has been around ever since there's been people around. There's always been some type of hierarchical structure in which some are at the top and some are at the bottom, and typically the people at the bottom have been exploited for either voluntary or involuntarily. So when did the slave trade begin? Well, the actual slave trade, the actual taking of prisoners, enslaving people, and then selling them for monetary value. This began in 700 CE. This means Common Era, AD. You can use those interchangeably, CE and AD. AD stands for Anno Domini, which means Year of Our Lord. So that is not going to, I guess, be the preference of everyone to me, it don't matter what you put CE, put AD, doesn't matter to me. I know what you're talking about. So in Africa, the slave trade began, but it began by Arab countries. We're talking about Arab countries. We're talking about countries like modern day Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan. We're talking about those countries. They began capturing and selling Africans as slaves, and they began taking these slaves to Asia in exchange for money, exchange for gold, exchange for silver, exchange for silk. Again, slavery becomes a money-making enterprise because it's free labor. I shouldn't say free labor, but it's unpaid labor, and that's going to have it a lot worse than paid laborers. You imagine if you do something for free that you can't really complain if it's not a good job. But the whole issue of slavery is it is both a race issue, is also a socioeconomic issue. It's a religious issue. People have been enslaved because of all three. People have been enslaved because of their race before. People have been enslaved because they are, again, poor. This is essentially the caste system. You don't have a high status in society, so you're subject to slavery. We've also seen this in religion. Religious slaves have been taken for, that's probably the oldest form of slavery. Looking back at the Jews in Egypt, if you want to look at biblical history with Exodus. We talked about Exodus a little bit when we talked about the pilgrims, about this being a new Exodus. So again, slavery has existed for millennia, thousands of years. But the Europeans, they would get involved in the African slave trade in the 1500s. This is while the Columbus the adventures are going on, while those are going on and those voyages by fellow Spanish, fellow Italian, fellow Portuguese, while they are now going to, again, the New World, they are also going to Africa. It is, again, around the same time that Columbus discovers the New World that the Portuguese discover a new route around Africa to get to Asia. And this is going to allow the Europeans more access into Africa. And during this time, the Europeans are going to become involved in the African slave trade because, again, this is a money-making enterprise. And that was the whole reason the Europeans even really wanted to find new trade routes to China, is to make more money or to bring more wealth to their people, especially those merchants or anybody that had access to any type of resource. Natural resources are limited in a sense, but human population does not have to be. Disease, famine, hunger, those can all definitely take out a large percent of the population, but as long as the population is continuing to reproduce, it expands exponentially. So the Europeans would begin the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is, again, selling slaves and sending them across the Atlantic Ocean. So the first slaves, the reason we're looking at this now is because we just finished talking about Jamestown last week. And, also this is going to kind of set the tone for us when we come to look later on this week of the differences between the southern, the middle, and the northern colonies. But the first slaves reach American soil in 1619 in the Jamestown colony. Now, here's something that I'll be honest, I didn't know this for a long time. And this is why history is we always need to kind of revisit it and really analyze it, not just take what other people tell us. So there were over 12 million Africans that were enslaved and shipped to the Americas. 10 million of them would actually survive the voyage called the Middle Passage. But I shouldn't say only. That's not the right word to use. I don't really know how I want to phrase it, so I'm just going to try to be as blunt as possible. There's 10 million Africans that are imprisoned and sent to the Americas. Less than 400,000 of them were shipped directly to the modern-day United States. Now, where did they go? Most of them went to South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. where the climate was much warmer and much more humid, making this like really hard, like growing weather. And because like the Europeans, they looked at the Africans as I gotta be careful with my words here, but they looked at the Africans as, again, like they come from a hot environment. They should be able to endure the temperature, the humidity, the environment, ecosystem, and they should be able to work, um, for extended amounts of time. This is why a lot of this is because, like, I'll say this: the slaves that do come to like the modern day United States, they're all coming to the southern colonies again, where the growing weather is a little bit again on the warmer side. There's longer growing periods, but the vast majority are sent to South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands because again, like their growing season is even longer because their seasons are very different. Because it is hotter, because it is more humid, things are growing rapidly. So this is where most of like Africans are sent. African slaves, they're sent to these areas than the United States. They were also much less likely to survive in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands versus the modern day United States. Now that doesn't, none of that like excuses this, but we have to, we can't look at history as if we would be the victim today. We have to look at history as if we would be the perpetrator, because any good thing or bad thing that's happened in history, we are more than capable of still doing. I think that's the biggest problem with maybe how history, I'm not saying how history is taught, but how history is process today. Like, oh, these people, how could they do such terrible things? It's like, well, if it happened, if people were doing this then, people will continue or will try to, they have the capacity to continuously do things like this. You look at how horrendous the slave trade was, and you may think that, oh, this would never, and nothing would ever happen like this again. And then you look at, World War II, and you look at the Holocaust, and you see not just like forced labor, but you see like, the extermination of a race and religious group. Right after World War II, you look at the gulags in the Soviet Union, and you see just like the forced labor to death, like every single, millions upon millions upon millions of deaths. People think that we're so far removed from a slave trade and slavery. Like, nah, we're not. We're not even closely removed from it. I read something a couple of years ago, and it said there's more slaves in the world today than there's ever been in the history of the world. And I thought, that's crazy. Then I looked into it, and it's talking about like human trafficking. And then it hit me. It's like, maybe that can be true. So again, while we may be far removed from the transatlantic slave trade, we're not far removed from the exploitation of people. So we still have the capacity to do terrible things. So we should not judge necessarily our ancestors on the same premises that we judge each other today. Now, that's not to excuse slavery. That is not to excuse slavery. It's just I don't think there's any excuse for it. But at the same time, that bad things still go on today too. It's a hard topic to talk about. I guess I'm gonna put myself in the middle here. All right, so let's take a look right here. So this is the triangle trade. This is the transatlantic slave trade. Now, here's what we're looking at. So what you see, this map it shows up a little bit better if one, I'm not in the way. Let's just move me right here. If one, I'm not in the way. Two, when we put it on like the board in class, like, all right, so what you see in light blue, these are the countries. These are the continents that we talked about: Europe, Africa, and the West Indies. Remember, this is what Columbus called them. This is the area, that most slaves are going, again, to the Caribbean islands, Central America, and to South America. Some are going to like Florida because, again, if you've been to Florida, especially in the summer, you know how hot and humid it can be. I lived in Florida for a little bit. Hot and humid, yep. So let's take a look and see what is going from place to place. Like, we know that there is a trade of slaves from Africa to the West Indies, but how does this all work? Well, from Africa to the West Indies, slaves are being sent, and this I guess area like that actually sailing across the Atlantic is called the Middle Passage. This is like the middle passage, the middle of this like triangle, and this is probably the most important. Like, if it wasn't for this, then nothing else would flow as it does. So slaves are being sent from Africa to the West Indies. And so what's happening there? Well, these slaves, again, are subject to forced labor. And why? Well, that is to harvest the natural resources, the raw materials, which we see right here, rum, cotton, tobacco, sugar, to send those raw materials back to Europe. What are they doing in Europe? What is in Europe? Europe has a lot of factories. So why are factories important here? Well, factories are important because you have these raw materials, but now you are actually like making like an item, a good from it that can be sold. And that is what are sold for slaves. We're going to talk just a minute about how like slaves became slaves, because it's not just it's more of a complicated process, I guess. So let's see. So the things that they are sending here, we're talking about like iron, talking about glass, guns, cotton. So this is, again, the triangle trade, the transatlantic slave trade. This is, when we look at this, we see that, again, goods are going from Europe to Africa in exchange for slaves. The slaves are going from Africa to the West Indies in exchange for slaves, raw materials, and then being sent back to Europe. Now, it is Europe pulling the strings here. Europe is the continent, I should say, responsible for the sending of goods, the selling of slaves, and the exportation of raw materials. So Europe's kind of running the show right here. Okay. Let's go to our next slide. So how did slaves become slaves? How do people, I shouldn't say slaves because no one is born a slave. They're made a slave, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So the first way, or one of the ways that people would become slaves, is they were kidnapped by Europeans. So again, like Europeans, they had guns, they had weaponry, high-level weaponry. Much in, when we look at like the continent of Africa, like we're looking at, again, they do not have like high capacity weapons. And we talk about high capacity weapons, we're just talking about like a gun that can shoot a bullet. And that is, extremely deadly. And especially when my battery's running low, especially when you take a look at like modern medicine, it's like, there's a gunshot victim now, just according to where it is, like, they got a pretty good shot of living. Back then you got to worry more about infection. That's well, give me a second. Let me plug this up. Like, you want to talk about infection. Most Civil War deaths were not actually from the actual, like, fighting itself. It was from disease, from infection. But kidnapped by Europeans, that's one way that people would become slaves. Second is they're prisoners of war from other rival tribes in Africa. So let's look at it this way. There's two ways to look at this that I hear. It's like, okay, well, because somebody's got to put the blame of the transatlantic slave trade on somebody. So who do they put it on? Well, some people put it on the Europeans. And they say, like, it was Europe that was doing all this. Europe were the ones in charge. Europe, captured and enslaved millions of Africans. And that is true. But what's also true is that Africans were also selling off like other Africans. So you have people from the same place and they are capturing each other and selling them to the Europeans. Now, some people look at that and they're like, how? Why? That could never happen. That could easily happen because you fight with people that look like you and act like you all the time. You fight with, and I'm not, and I say you, I mean me too. Like, we all like disagree with people that have a lot in common with us, and the things in common that these people have, like these African people, they have is like they have relatively the same like complexion. They have, they're in generally, I guess, similar locations, but outside of that, like they're very different. Like you got to remember that tribes in Africa, they vary a lot from tribe to tribe, just like with the natives. Any type of tribal atmosphere, you're going to have different beliefs, you're going to have different traditions, different cultures. And it's different cultures and, again, different languages. And maybe that's the biggest one because, again, we've talked about this. Like if there's a language barrier, there's going to be it's going to be very difficult to, to break some of those differences down. So, if you were from a rival or another tribe, did not mean that, all tribes didn't like get along. All tribes didn't, try to help each other. They would fight and kill each other, make war with each other. And so some, future slaves would first be prisoners by other African tribes that would be sold into the Europeans or to the Europeans to be part of the transatlantic slave trade. Third way, they became slaves to pay off debt. So this would be more so what we call indentured servants. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But this is more so indentured servitude. And this was more so, this did not have that race component to it. So like Europeans that had gotten into some trouble or Europeans that had got into, again, a lot of debt and that owed people money, they could essentially like sign up to be a slave for 7 years. And then after their 7-year servitude, they were granted their freedom and free from debt. This was a popular form of, it's similar to slavery, but it's not. Again, like slavery was not voluntary and it didn't come with like perks and the potential to like earn your freedom. So it's referred to as slavery in a sense, but indentured servitude, again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, different than what we think of when we think of the word slavery. Lastly, we're another way that people become slaves is they were born into slavery. Hold on one second, be born into slavery. This is what we call chattel slavery, and this is the type of slavery that the United States is going to be not responsible for, but this is the type of slavery that is going to come up when we look at like the United States involvement with slavery and its history with slavery, and it's a checkered past, and it's mainly because of this being born into slavery. What that does is it makes like slavery continuously regenerating itself and producing more slaves generation by generation. Like, just think about it. If you look at like population growth and how population growth works, you look at 100 years ago, look at the population then, you look at the population now, it is so much bigger. Same thing here. Over the course of just a few generations, there can be many more slaves because now you've taken out the process of actually finding them and handling them. Instead, you're allowing the slaves to continuously repopulate. And so what this would do is it creates like a continuous cycle. And it's not until the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, at the end of Jim Crow, it would take all of these things to kind of get slavery out of the picture. All right, so let's look at a couple more things, and then we'll be done for today. So let's look at the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is what we were talking about, that actual voyage. And this is also called the Atlantic Passage. Again, it is that boat, on the ship, on the boat from Africa to the Americas. Again, most slaves, went to the southern colonies, most slaves in like modern day United States of America, but 90% of all slaves went to South America, the others going to Central America, the Caribbean, and then again, whatever was left, which was, around 400,000 were sent to the southern colonies. So we're talking like Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, those areas. The voyage itself was about 5,000 miles. It would take about 2 months. Slaves were chained together in close living quarters. I put no toilet because I need you to kind of visualize exactly what that would look like for 2 months, chained together. Like in cramped, like can't even like not even standing up, like hunched and slouched and essentially like stuck in the same exact spot for 2 months. I need you to visualize that a little bit, and that's really what our primary source today is trying to do, is getting us to visualize what it must have been like. 15 to 25% of the slaves that were on each given ship died on the voyage, on the Middle Passage. Disease was the biggest issue because, again, it's so close of living quarters that the spreading of any disease is going to be very quick. It's going to spread rapidly. And again, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about exponential growth. Rape, murder, and suicide were also common aboard slave ships. Again, I don't necessarily want you to visualize that, but I do need you to at least think about it a little bit. Exactly how torturous and how inhumane like this would have been, being being a part of the transatlantic slave trade and being sent through the Middle Passage. And so this is what our primary source today is talking about. It's a firsthand account of a man that was captured and enslaved, and he wrote down, or he essentially wrote this down in retrospect of his experience. And we can learn a lot from that. That's why I love showing you guys primary source stuff, because it doesn't just give you like what I think on a topic. What I think on a topic is irrelevant. That's not my job. My job is to just give you factual information, give you some, give you some pieces from different people, what they think on different aspects of history, their own experience. And so that's why I like showing you guys primary source stuff. So I definitely want you to take a look at that. Also, I want you to check out the slideshow. Right here, we're looking at like how these ships were constructed and what this would look like. So, like what you see right here, like this is the picture of like slaves, and this is how they would be boarded. There's much more room for like everything else, like supplies, everything, but the actual people are just crammed. So I want you to look at this. I want you to try to visualize as much as you can of this. Again, we cannot look at things as if they can never happen again. I think that's a mistake. I think that's how even worse things happen. I think that's how the worst things in history have happened, is because people think that what happened before cannot happen again. So I really want you to take some time and kind of think about this a little bit. There's some great parts about American history. There's some parts that aren't so great. This is one of those. But American history, United States history, does not begin with 1619. United States history begins much later with the birth of the United States, because everybody right now in the modern day United States is of British background, of French background, of Spanish background, Portuguese background, and now with the transatlantic slave trade, African background. This would eventually come to make up the United States, but those ideals, they're not drawn out just yet. All right, appreciate you guys. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and thank you. What just happened? Oh, I just did that. Oh. Hmm. There was one more slide I didn't get to.